The night doesn't arrive gently on a battlefield. It descends like a suffocation, stealing color and certainty in equal measure. November 1944, Normandy, and the darkness is absolute. There are no stars visible tonight, only the occasional flare that bleeds a sickly yellow across the horizon before dying into black again. In that blackness, somewhere ahead on a Norman road turned to frozen mud, an ambulance moves. You cannot see it yet. If you were standing at the roadside, you might hear it first, the low grinding of an engine working hard, the splash of tires through water-filled shell craters, the creak of suspension pushed beyond reason. This is the sound of the Royal Army Medical Corps keeping Britons wounded alive on a night when everything, every instinct, every sense, tells you that movement itself is impossible. The driver's name is James Hartley, and he has been awake for 37 hours. If you were to ask him what day it is, he would need to think about it. Monday feels like it might be Tuesday now, or perhaps it has already become Wednesday. Time has become a luxury he no longer possesses, replaced instead by the immediate, the urgent, the never-ending. His hands grip the steering wheel of the Ford ambulance with a tension that has calcified into permanence. The calluses on his palms have calluses now. His eyes, fixed forward into the darkness, are the only part of him still moving with any shred of intention. Everything else has become machine-like, automated by repetition and necessity. Beside him sits Tommy, the co-driver, barely 22, who has learned to sleep while remaining technically awake, a skill that seems to belong to this war alone. Behind them, in the back of the ambulance, are 4 stretcher cases and 2 sitting cases. They are not merely passengers. They are the entire purpose of this vehicle's existence tonight. One man is bleeding through fresh dressings despite the attempt by the orderly, Morrison, to control it an hour ago. Another is conscious but wishes he weren't. A third has stopped making sounds of any kind, which is either a good sign or the worst kind of sign. And in the darkness, with only the occasional tremor of the vehicle to remind them that they are still alive, there is no way to be certain which. This is not a job that appears in peacetime recruitment posters. There are no medals for it in any official capacity, though the weight of it might as well be carved from lead. The driver of an ambulance on the forward lines of the Second World War occupies a strange and terrible space. He is not a combatant, yet he operates in combat zones. He is not supposed to be shot at, yet he frequently is. He is responsible for machines that are barely roadworthy, for navigating roads that no longer exist in any meaningful sense, and for delivering human beings, some of whom will live because of his skill and dedication, others of whom will die regardless of anything he does, and some of whom will die precisely because he did not move fast enough, could not find a road, could not navigate the crater fields, could not defy the laws of physics and the weight of German artillery. The masking of lights had seemed almost manageable when explained in training. Fit the hood over the headlights. Leave only the smallest aperture uncovered. Paint the front with a thick coat of dark blue or black, leaving only a slit for visibility. It had seemed logical then, in the training camp, when you had daylight and instructions and someone checking your work. In actual wartime darkness, on roads you have never driven before, with 4 wounded men whose lives depend on your arriving at the field hospital before infection or shock claims them, the logic becomes something closer to madness. The hooded headlights illuminate almost nothing. They provide just enough light to suggest that there is a road ahead, a cruel hint of what might be there, rather than any genuine visibility. The rest of the night is pure guesswork, instinct, and the kind of desperate hope that has no place in military procedure, but everything to do with survival. Tommy shifts slightly, and his eyes open. He is not asleep after all, or perhaps he has already woken, and is maintaining the fiction of rest, because it requires less emotional energy to pretend to be unconscious than to actually confront the present moment. "Crater?" he asks, having felt a sudden drop in the vehicle's trajectory. "3rd and 2 miles," James replies, keeping his voice flat. "There'll be more." The craters are the landscape now. What was once farmland, Norman bocage, walled fields separated by thick hedgerows, has been transformed into something from another world entirely. The bombing has redrawn the map. Fields that existed on the maps are gone, replaced by overlapping circles of destruction. Roads that had names and histories are now simply guesses. Entire stretches of what should be navigable terrain are instead networks of obstacles. Craters filled with water and bodies, felled trees, abandoned vehicles, trenches filled with mud, and the ever-present barbed wire, invisible in the darkness, waiting to catch a wheel or slice through a tire. Navigation happens through landmarks that must be memorized and recognized in absolute darkness. There is the ruined church tower. Except tonight, there are 3 structures that might be church towers, and only one of them is correct. There is the intact farmhouse, where the signpost pointed east, except the farmhouse is no longer standing, and the signpost was pulled up 3 weeks ago. There is the smell of the village, the particular scent of limestone from the walls mixed with smoke and decay. But that carries for miles on a damp night and provides only an approximate sense of direction, not precision. Behind James and Tommy, Morrison is doing what Morrison does every night on every drive. He is monitoring, checking, adjusting. The orderly in an ambulance operates in a space so constrained that human dignity becomes a theoretical concept. He moves between 4 stretchers suspended at different heights, checking dressings, holding someone's hand when consciousness returns and the reality of wounds becomes suddenly, desperately present, communicating back to the drivers through a small window that looks into the cab. There's a whole language of taps and signals that has developed. 1 tap for pain levels, 2 taps for breathing problems, 3 taps for fever, a long series of taps for the particular distress of someone who believes they are about to die. Most nights, at least one of those long series of taps occurs. Tonight, it is already happening, and they have not yet reached the first aid post. The decision occurs in fragments. James feels the slight change in engine tone that tells him someone in the back has moved. Morrison's face appears at the viewing window, and even in the dashboard light, the tiny green glow that barely qualifies as light at all, his expression is readable. The man on the left stretcher is deteriorating. The bleeding has become serious again, past the stage where a field dressing can manage it. He needs proper surgical intervention, and he needs it now, not after another hour of rough roads and shell craters. Which way to the nearest CCS? Morrison's voice comes through the small window, tight with controlled urgency. CCS, Casualty Clearing Station. The system is meant to be elegant. Wounded go from RAP, Regimental Aid Post, to ADS, Advanced Dressing Station, to CCS, and finally to the base hospital if they are stable enough for transport. But the system exists in theory. In practice, the roads collapse, the stations are overrun, and drivers make decisions in the darkness based on incomplete information and the sound of a man's breathing becoming shallow. James knows where the CCS should be. 3 miles north, or what he believes to be north. But the route has been changing daily as the roads become impassable and new routes are established and then abandoned. He has the map, but reading a map in the darkness with hooded headlights is not possible. He has the compass, mechanical and precise, but it offers no information about whether the road it indicates still exists. We take the Via Road north, he says. Half an hour if it's clear. And if it isn't, then longer. This is the contract they have all signed, without ever formally acknowledging it. In the darkness, with wounded men, with shells falling somewhere in the distance, and the constant possibility of aircraft overhead, there are no guarantees. There are only choices, and the choices come weighted with consequences that no training can prepare you for. The turn onto the Via Road is marked by a white-painted rock and the smell of petrol, a burned-out truck from 2 days ago. James has passed this junction 17 times in the past week. The muscle memory of it is embedded in him now. The road, such as it is, widens here. This had been a secondary road before the war, before the bombing, before everything that mattered was burned away. Now it is a network of ruts and craters, frozen solid at the edges, but containing a viscous center of mud and water that pulls at the wheels like something alive, trying to hold the ambulance back. The engine sounds different on this road, straining harder against the suction of the earth. James downshifts, and the vehicle slows. Behind them, the wounded man, his name is Taylor, Private Edward Taylor from somewhere in Wales, makes a sound that is almost a moan, almost a word, almost a prayer. Steady on. Morrison calls forward. He's asking if we're stopping. Tell him we're getting closer, James says. though he has no idea if this is true. In the darkness, getting closer to anywhere is an act of faith, rather than navigation. The vehicle ahead of them, another ambulance, one of their three-strong convoy, suddenly stops. James brakes carefully, not wanting to hydroplane on the muddy surface. Tommy is forward in his seat, trying to pierce the darkness with his eyes. "Crater?" Tommy asks. "Or debris," James replies. "Or the road itself decided it had had enough." There's a procedure for this. Morrison jumps down from the back, torch in hand, directing the beam toward the obstruction. One of the drivers from the leading ambulance is already out, examining the situation. The torches, even with their minimal output, wrapped in cloth and paper to restrict light, seem impossibly bright after the journey through absolute darkness. Any German observer within miles would be able to see them. But protocol exists because protocol keeps things organized. And at this moment, with 4 or 5 wounded men in each vehicle, organization is all that stands between order and catastrophe. The crater is new, or at least James has not encountered it before on this road. It is perhaps 6 feet across, half filled with water. The edges are sharp, the kind of fresh destruction that suggests the bombing here is recent, within the last few days. The leading ambulance would not be able to cross it. There is a possibility, but only if they build up enough speed and hit it correctly, of the vehicle bouncing across the crater rather than sliding into it. But this is not standard procedure, and the driver, a cautious man named Richardson, is already making the calculation that it is not worth the risk to 4 wounded men to attempt it. "We go back," Richardson's voice carries across the frozen night. "There's a route through the village. Takes longer, but we avoid the main road." "How much longer?" James calls back. 20 minutes. Maybe 30. The village is torn up from the bombing, but there's a way through if you know it. James does not know it. Very few drivers know every alternative route yet. The terrain is changing too quickly. But that hardly matters. The decisions have already been made for them by the landscape itself. They will take the route through the village, and they will lose time, and they will calculate whether the loss of time matters more than the risk of attempting to cross a crater in the darkness with wounded men in the back. The convoy reverses. This operation takes 10 minutes, each vehicle backing up with painful slowness, guided by torchlight and hand signals, until there is enough room to turn onto the narrow lane that leads to what was once a village called Saint-Laurent-de-Fremont. The lane is barely wide enough for the ambulance. Hedgerows, torn and damaged, brush against the sides of the vehicle. Branches scrape across the canvas, covering the ambulance body, making sounds that seem designed to wake every German gun position within 10 miles. The village appears gradually, materializing out of the darkness like a slow hallucination. There are buildings here, or what remains of them. Half-collapsed stone walls define the shapes of houses that no longer serve any purpose. A church with its roof blown off stands like a shell of itself. The tower James had been looking for earlier apparently located 5 miles down a completely different road. The streets are craters and rubble. There's a smell here, a particular smell that carries through all the destroyed villages, the smell of death and burnt stone, and something acrid that might be cordite, or might be the smell of human desperation rendered physical. The leading ambulance navigates slowly, feeling its way forward like a blind man in a familiar room. James follows, keeping distance to avoid becoming entangled with it should it suddenly break. Tommy's hand reaches over and squeezes James's shoulder, a brief gesture of something, not comfort exactly, but acknowledgement that they are still here, still functioning, still moving toward the next objective. A dog watches them from beside a partially destroyed house. It is a gray, or perhaps white dog, impossible to tell in the darkness, and it tracks the movement of the convoy with an intensity that suggests it has seen enough vehicles pass through the village to understand that they mean nothing to it anymore. The dog doesn't bark. It simply watches, and then it turns away, disappearing into the rubble as though it has already made a calculation about what these vehicles represent and decided it is not worth the effort to respond. The route through the village seems to take hours, though James's watch, checked briefly at a place where enough light from a distant flare makes it visible, shows it has been only 18 minutes. Time moves differently here. Minutes stretch and compress according to rules that have nothing to do with mechanics or physics. 10 minutes of normal driving becomes an hour. An hour of waiting becomes a single breath. They emerge on the other side of St. Laurent and find themselves on a road that is, by comparison to what they have just navigated, almost civilized. It is still muddy, still cratered in places, but it is wider, and it is clearer. Progress becomes possible. The ambulance accelerates slightly, and the engine note changes to something less strained. Behind him, James hears Morrison moving about in the back, checking the men again, assessing whether the slower progress through the village has caused additional trauma, or whether anyone has improved, deteriorated, or simply remained in the strange liminal space where they have been suspended for the past several hours. Taylor is still alive. That much James learns from Morrison's gesture through the viewing window. The young man from Wales, probably 25, though shock and pain and the particular exhaustion of combat makes it impossible to determine anyone's age accurately anymore, is still breathing, still maintaining. The other 3 men are stable, or as close to stable as you get in the back of a vehicle being driven across a landscape that has been specifically and thoroughly destroyed by aerial bombardment and artillery. The CCS, when they finally reach it, is announced first by the smell of antiseptic, which carries on the wind, and then by the sight of vehicles parked in careful rows. There are other ambulances here, jeeps, supply trucks. There are people moving about with the particular efficiency of trained chaos. The field hospital exists in what had been a farm, the barn converted into a triage station, the farmhouse itself serving as an operating theater. Canvas tents stretch out behind the main buildings, containing beds and wounded and the constant activity of people trying to prevent death from winning its particular battles. A medical officer, a Captain Morris, with the kind of exhausted competence that comes from having been awake for days, approaches the ambulance as soon as it stops. He is already checking the dressing on the first stretcher case before Morrison has fully opened the back doors. "How long from the RAP?" Morris asks, directing the question to whoever will answer it. 7 hours, Morrison replies. Longest route because of the crater fields. This one, Morris indicates Taylor, the young man from Wales. Bleeding's getting worse. Abdominal area. Field packs not holding it. Morris nods, already making calculations. Straight to theater. Let's go. The handover happens in practiced movements. Taylor is transferred from the ambulance to a wheeled stretcher, and his entire journey, from being wounded in a ditch somewhere north of Cherbourg, to the regimental aid post, where his wounds were first dressed, to the advanced dressing station, where the severity was assessed, to this moment in the darkness at a field hospital, is handed over to other hands, other people, other systems. It is the only way this can work. The drivers cannot afford to become emotionally invested in outcomes. They deliver the cargo, and then they return to the roads and the darkness to collect more. The other 3 men are similarly transferred, assessed, and processed. One is able to walk, which changes his entire status. He will have a better chance simply because his wounds are not so severe that he requires transportation in a horizontal position. The other 2 will need to stay until they are stable enough for evacuation to a base hospital, which might be days or might be weeks, depending on how the war progresses and whether the front remains stable or suddenly shifts again. Morrison returns to the ambulance carrying supplies. More field dressings, more morphine, more of the materials that are used up in the work of keeping men alive on destroyed roads in the darkness. James and Tommy get 20 minutes for tea in a covered area near the CCS. The tea is hot and tastes faintly of gasoline, but it is hot and it is liquid and it remains in the body, providing some small increment of functioning. Another run? Tommy asks, because the answer is almost always yes, because the wounded are always waiting, because the night is long and the need is constant. 3 more scheduled. One of the orderlies tells them, "We've got reports of a night engagement 3 miles north. Expect casualties to start arriving at the RAP in about an hour. If you can be ready, we can get you back on the road." This is the rhythm. Collect the wounded. Transport them. Deliver them. Return to collect more wounded. Repeat until dawn, and then repeat again as soon as darkness falls. There are nights. There are entire weeks. where James does not leave the ambulance except to use a latrine or to fill the fuel can. His body has learned to function in a state of permanent fatigue. Sleep, when it comes, happens in 15-minute increments, and it is never restful, never actually sleeping, but rather a kind of existence just below consciousness, ready to be interrupted at any moment by someone opening a door or an engine starting. The journey back north takes them past positions being dug in, past guns being moved, past the constant preparation for the next assault. The war is not static. It moves, and the ambulance drivers move with it, always staying slightly behind the line, never too far forward to be in the immediate line of fire, never so far back that they cannot reach the newly wounded quickly enough to matter. It is a precise balance, and it is maintained through constant communication, updated information, and the accumulated knowledge of drivers who have learned, through necessity and repetition, how to navigate a landscape that is actively, continuously being destroyed. The new run takes them to positions east of the Vire, where a company of infantry is holding a line against German counterattacks. The RAP is established in a cellar that survived the bombing, and the MO there, a young doctor named Sinclair, who speaks with an Edinburgh accent and drinks cold tea, because hot tea requires the lighting of a stove, which requires more care than he is willing to expend right now, has 3 stretcher cases ready to move. All 3. James asks, because 3 men in an ambulance designed to carry 4 stretchers means they are carrying wounded who might not survive a rough journey, and rough journeys are all that exist anymore. All 3, Sinclair confirms. This one here is priority 1. Chest wound, breathing's labored. I've done what I can, but he needs a surgeon in the next 2 hours, not 4. Priority 1 means they will take him first, drive faster, take the most direct route regardless of the state of the roads. It means accepting higher risk, because the risk of not moving fast enough is already too high. It is the calculus of emergency medicine in wartime, and it is written into the code that these men have accepted, whether they acknowledged it or not when they volunteered for the ambulance corps. The priority 1 case is a sergeant, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of gray hair that suggests he has seen previous wars, or at least sufficient peace, to remember that peace exists. His chest is bandaged heavily, and there is a slight whistling sound when he breathes, which is the sound of air escaping, where it should not be escaping, and Morrison's face, when he gets into the back, to check the man's condition, is the face of someone who is doing rapid calculations about whether this man will survive the journey. Direct route, James says, not asking. Fastest CCS. Fastest CCS that has surgical capacity. Sinclair corrects. That's about 4 miles north. Road's bad there, but it's passable if you know it. James does not know it. There's a map, of course. Maps exist, and they are updated daily as conditions change, but a map and actual terrain are only occasionally aligned. Tommy, though, recognizes some of the landmarks Sinclair is describing, and between them they construct a route from information and intuition and the particular knowledge that comes from having driven nearly every possible road in this corner of Normandy multiple times. The journey is fast and brutal. The ambulance bounces over craters and through water-filled ruts, and the sergeant in the back, with his labored breathing and his chest wound, experiences every single impact as a small additional trauma. Morrison sits with him, holding him steady, communicating with James through the viewing window when the bouncing becomes too severe. But there's no option to go slower. Fast and brutal is better than slow and fatal. And the simple truth is that every minute matters. The wound is significant, and gravity and shock and the basic physics of bleeding out are all working against survival. Speed becomes a form of treatment in itself. The CCS is dark and efficient and already overwhelmed. Patients are backed up outside the tents, waiting for space to open up. But when James pulls up and explains that this is a priority 1, a chest wound with possible pneumothorax, the medical officer working triage makes space. The sergeant is transferred to stretcher and then immediately to an operating tent. He will probably survive, or he will not, and that will be determined in the next few hours by the skills of the surgeons and the luck of vascular systems that may or may not have been damaged beyond repair. The other 2 men, both with lower body wounds, both of them considerably younger than the sergeant, are assessed and placed in the queue for surgery. They will wait, depending on surgical schedule, for somewhere between 4 hours and 18 hours. Some of them will survive, will be evacuated, will eventually make it back to England or to a hospital in North Africa or to wherever the chain of evacuation leads them. Some of them will not. Infection can develop in hours. Shock can claim a man who looked stable at intake. The wound that seemed manageable can become a crisis. The convoy returns to the positions to collect more wounded. This time there are 4 men, and this time one of them, a boy, really, probably 19, with a shattered leg and shock that has rendered him almost silent, is terrified. He keeps asking the same question. Will I lose it? Will I lose the leg? And Morrison, because there is nothing else to do, keeps saying the same answer. The doctors will do everything they can. You just focus on staying calm and staying with us. Whether the leg will be saved is determined by 1,000 factors. The location of the fractures, the vascular damage, the infection risk, the skill of the surgeons, the simple luck of circulation continuing to function. But none of those factors matter to the boy right now. What matters is the voice of Morrison saying the same thing over and over until it becomes a kind of prayer or a kind of hymn that allows the boy to remain conscious and functional rather than surrendering to panic. The night develops a rhythm. Collect the wounded. Transport them. Deliver them. Return to collect more. Each cycle is exhausting. Each cycle requires decisions about routing and timing and risk that have no textbook answers. The war is a series of problems that have no good solutions, only different configurations of consequences. Drive slowly and risk the wounded deteriorating. Drive fast and risk the wounded being battered by impacts that can cause additional damage. Navigate through the village and lose time. Navigate directly and risk crater fields and destroyed roads. Stop for maintenance because the ambulance is showing signs of strain and risk losing momentum. Keep driving because momentum is all that matters and risk the ambulance failing entirely, leaving 4 or 5 wounded men stranded in the darkness while you attempt repairs that might take hours. By the time dawn approaches, the darkness beginning to gray rather than to brighten, a slow leakage of light from some distant eastern horizon that is still covered in smoke from the night's bombardment. James has completed 11 separate runs, 11 collections of wounded, 11 deliveries to field hospitals and casualty clearing stations. 42 men moved from positions to medical facilities, some of them critically, some of them stable, all of them taken from the immediate front where they were waiting for treatment in rain and cold and the terror of knowing that they might bleed out before help arrived. The ambulance is running on fumes, literally and figuratively. The fuel gauge shows less than a quarter tank. The engine is making a sound that suggests it has taken enough punishment for one night and is considering whether continued operation is worth the effort. The windscreen has multiple impacts where shrapnel or debris has struck it, creating spiderwebs of cracks that Tommy finally gave up trying to see through somewhere around 3 a.m. and simply opened the side window instead, driving by feel and instinct rather than vision. Morrison is asleep in the back, actually sleeping now rather than maintaining fiction. He has earned it. His face is covered in blood that is not his own, and he has not slept in 28 hours, and his particular gift is the ability to recognize when something cannot be done and to surrender to the body's need to simply stop functioning for a period of time. The final run of the night is different. The radio crackles, and the voice is urgent in a different way. There has been a bombing run on the positions, and there are multiple casualties, maybe a dozen, maybe more, scattered across an area near the village of St. Aubin. The ambulances are needed immediately, and they are needed in numbers greater than what is currently available. Every ambulance that can move is being requested. James looks at Tommy. Tommy looks at James. They both know this means this is not the final run. This means the night is not ending. It is evolving into something worse. One more, James says. We do one more, and then we find someone to take the ambulance because neither of us is safe to drive anymore. Tommy nods. He does not argue. They both understand the mathematics. Exhaustion plus responsibility for human lives equals a calculation that must be made carefully. Pushing past this point means accepting that they might crash the ambulance, that they might miss a turn and roll, that they might make a navigation error that leaves them stuck and unable to retrieve wounded. There are costs to continuing, and at some point those costs become unacceptable. The journey to St. Aubin takes them into an area they have not driven before, or at least James cannot remember driving here. The bombing has completely redrawn this section of the landscape. What was once a small Norman village is now scattered wreckage. The houses are collapsed. The church is a crater with fragments of stone scattered across 100 yards. The roads, plural, because there were multiple roads here before, are no longer distinguishable as roads. They are simply patterns of destruction stretching across terrain. The wounded are there, though. They have learned to gather. The personnel from the aid posts and the medics, who have been trained to recognize that when aircraft come and bombs fall, you must immediately start treating people where they lie and wait for the ambulances to arrive. There are 5 casualties visible as James pulls the ambulance to a stop. There's blood on the ground. There's the smell of explosives. There's the particular silence that follows a bombing run, the way the world seems to hold its breath before gradually resuming its ambient noise. One of the medics, a corporal, his uniform torn and his face cut by shrapnel, approaches the ambulance. "We've got 5 that can be moved," he says. 2 more buried. We're digging, but probably won't get them out alive. 2 already deceased. James asks. 3. The corporal corrects. 1 arrived DOA. The other 2 were dead before we could get them out of the rubble. This is the arithmetic of war. 5 wounded who need transport. 3 dead who will stay here until someone decides what to do with bodies in this landscape, where everything is temporary and nothing is ever properly resolved. James feels something that might be exhaustion or might be the particular hollowness that comes from experiencing too much death in too short a period of time. "Load them in," he says. "We'll get them to the closest CCS." The loading takes 15 minutes. One of the men has severe crush injuries and cannot be moved without causing additional trauma. One is conscious but wishes she were not, a VAD who was staffing a first aid post when the bombing began, hit by fragmentation from a German aircraft's bombs. One is burned, and badly enough that the smell of his wounds is visible in the way the medics move around him, careful not to touch anything that will cause additional pain. 2 are less obviously injured, but are in shock severe enough that they have ceased responding to stimuli. Morrison crawls out of the back of the ambulance to help with the loading. He is awake now, called back to consciousness by the urgency and the particular gravity of what is happening. His hands move with automatic competence, adjusting dressings, checking pulses, making the rapid assessment that comes from having done this 1,000 times in the past weeks. "The burned one won't make it," Morrison says to James quietly while loading the last patient. "Not without specialist burn treatment, and we don't have that this far forward. Best we can do is pain management and comfort care." The medics know that. James asks. "They know," Morrison confirms. "But they're still hoping. People tend to do that, even when there's no reasonable basis for it." The drive to the CCS is slow and careful, not because speed is not important, but because going too fast will cause the burned man to scream, and once you hear someone scream from pain, it is difficult to continue any action that makes them worse. So James drives at what feels like walking pace, navigating around the craters and debris with the precision of someone handling something infinitely fragile. The sky is beginning to lighten now, the darkness gradually becoming gray. In a few more hours, it will be daylight, and the ambulances will be visible, and the German aircraft will return, and the entire cycle will continue. But for now, in this moment of not quite dawn, the world is still shadowed enough to provide some safety. The 5 wounded from St. Aubin are delivered to the CCS, and the medical staff there, already overwhelmed, already running with surgical capacity pushed beyond reasonable limits, make room. The burned man is given morphine and placed in a tent. The VAD is triaged for possible evacuation if surgery can stabilize her. The crush injuries are taken to theater for assessment, and James and Tommy, having now been awake for something in excess of 42 hours, are told by the MO to stand down and get some sleep. The ambulance stays, the MO explains. But you 2 are no use to anyone in your current state. There's a tent with supplies behind the CCS. Get some sleep. We'll have other drivers taking the ambulance for the next 12 hours. You rest. This is not a suggestion. This is an order, and it carries the weight of medical authority. James wants to argue, wants to explain that there are more wounded, that the night is not finished, that standing down means abandoning the work. But Tommy is already heading toward the tent the MO indicated, and the MO is looking at him with the kind of expression that suggests that if James does not leave voluntarily, he will be carried out, and James knows that this is probably true. The tent contains 2 cots and a canvas roof, and the kind of cold that suggests no heating of any kind has been applied to it. But it also contains, when Morrison checks, emergency rations and 2 bottles of water that are still cool. They eat because eating is automatic, because the body demands fuel even when the mind is no longer really connected to the body. They drink, and then they lie down on the cots, and the sleep that comes is not restful or peaceful. It is the kind of sleep that comes from systems shutting down out of necessity rather than out of satisfaction. It is filled with dreams of driving through darkness, of roads that do not exist, of wounded men who speak without moving their mouths, of the particular terror of being unable to find the way forward. When they wake, 3 hours later, because that is all the time available before the next convoy needs drivers, the war has not paused. The wounded are still arriving. The casualty clearing station is still overwhelmed. The ambulances are still needed. And the afternoon is beginning to develop into evening, which will become night, which will bring the darkness and the bombing and the chaos again. This is the work that sustains the British forces in Normandy. This is the system that keeps the wounded alive long enough for them to have a chance. The drivers and the orderlies and the medical officers and the ambulances that exist in this space between the front lines and the hospitals, they are the tissue that holds the organism together, the connective tissue that allows the machine of war to continue functioning. If you are watching this video, you understand now the kind of men who maintained the flow of wounded through the long nights of 1944 in Normandy. These were not the soldiers who charged the positions or held the line or engaged in direct combat. These were something different. Men who existed in the spaces between combat and hospitals, who navigated destroyed landscapes in absolute darkness, who made decisions about who would receive treatment first based on probability and ethics rather than any textbook procedure. If you want to learn more about the stories of men who fought not with weapons, but with courage and skill against the simple mechanics of survival, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We have many more stories of medical service, of the hidden systems that kept the war machine functioning, of the people who rarely made it into the history books, but whose work changed the course of human lives in ways that are still measured today. The winter of 1944 is settling into the mountains around Cassino, and it brings with it a kind of cold that has learned the specific geography of mountain warfare. James Hartley has been reassigned, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that he has been redistributed, pulled from the Normandy front and transported by truck and shipped to Italy, where the fighting has taken on an entirely different character. The bocage has been replaced by mountains. The Norman cold has been replaced by an alpine cold that carries a different kind of bite. And the pace of operations, while still demanding, has changed from the constant cycle of night runs to something more episodic, more dependent on the rhythms of mountain warfare and the slower movement of troops up terrain that does not allow for rapid advance. Cassino is not a place that anyone arrives at planning to stay. It is a place you arrive at because the war has dictated that you must, and it is a place you understand, quickly, that you will not be leaving easily. The town sits at the confluence of roads that come up from Naples and branch off toward different directions. It has strategic importance, and therefore has received the kind of attention from artillery that strategic importance always attracts in modern warfare. Entire buildings are missing. The streets are rubble. And above the town, on a mountain that rises with deceptive gentleness from a distance, but with entirely genuine severity when you approach it, sits a monastery. The monastery of Monte Cassino has become the center of the strategic conversation about Cassino and the Italian front. The Allies have decided that it is being used as a German observation post, though the actual evidence for this is mixed. The Germans have said they have no military personnel in the monastery, though that claim has similarly uncertain basis. And so the question has arisen, should the monastery be bombed? Should this ancient structure, this site of religious significance, be destroyed as part of the military necessity of war? The answer, made at levels of command far above where James Hartley operates, has been yes. The The monastery will be bombed, and when it is bombed, there will be wounded, and the wounded will need to be transported. And James Hartley will be one of the people driving the ambulances. The bombing occurs on February 15th, 1944, and it is comprehensive. Wave after wave of aircraft comes over the mountain, and the monastery, ancient, thick-walled, architecturally designed to withstand siege and weather in time itself, is slowly, methodically destroyed. The rubble that results will be used by the Germans to create defensive positions, which will result in a self-fulfilling prophecy about the strategic value of the monastery. But at the moment of the bombing, none of that has been determined yet. What exists is simply destruction and the subsequent need for medical response. The casualties from the bombing are primarily Italian civilians. Their numbers, depending on who is counting, ranging from a few dozen to several hundred. There are also German soldiers, though fewer of them, and their wounded are handled through different systems and channels. And there are Allied soldiers who have been hit by the bombardment, both by the aircraft themselves and by the subsequent German counterbombardment in response to the bombing of the monastery. James finds himself driving through streets he barely recognizes, past rubble that has become even more extensive, toward positions where Italian civilians and military personnel are congregating, trying to understand what has happened. The ambulance is marked with red crosses, which provide some additional measure of immunity from attack, though that immunity is increasingly understood as theoretical rather than absolute. There are stories of ambulances being deliberately targeted by German forces, of the red crosses providing a specific point of aim rather than a guarantee of safety. But the red crosses remain painted on the vehicles because the appearance of being a medical vehicle still provides more protection than the appearance of being a military target. The first casualty James collects is an old woman, probably 70, with a crush injury to her legs. She speaks only Italian, and though James has acquired some basic Italian vocabulary through repetition and through mixing with other drivers and orderlies who have been in Italy longer, he cannot understand what she is saying beyond the basic words. No. Hurt. Help. She is in shock, and her wounds are severe enough that her chances of surviving are diminished, but she is alive, and moving her quickly might preserve that alive status. What's her situation? Morrison asks, having worked his way into the back of the ambulance. Crush injuries, both legs. Secondary lacerations, abdominal area where she was hit by falling debris. She's 75 years old. No obvious life-threatening immediate injuries, but the crush could cause problems if we move her wrong. We need to move her. James calls back from the cab. There's a field hospital set up about 2 miles south. It's the closest facility. The woman's name, they discover from her attempts at communication, is Maria. She was working in a building that is no longer standing when the bombing occurred. She was not killed, which she seems to understand as either a miraculous occurrence or an inexplicable cruelty, depending on how you interpret her expressions and her words. She is holding a small crucifix, and it becomes apparent as they drive that she is praying, or attempting to pray, though the motion of the ambulance and the pain of her injuries makes concentrated prayer difficult. The field hospital in Italy is different from the ones in Normandy. It is more established, more permanent, organized in ways that suggest a longer-term commitment to staying in place. There is electricity generated by portable generators. There are actual surgical suites rather than canvas tents. There are supplies organized in ways that suggest sufficient supply lines rather than constant improvisation. This is what proper medical infrastructure looks like, and it operates with an efficiency that would seem luxurious compared to the experience in Normandy. Maria is taken to surgery, and James and Tommy and Morrison are briefed by the medical officer on the situation. The monastery bombing has generated approximately 300 casualties, though the exact number is uncertain. Most are Italian civilians. The medical system is attempting to deal with the volume, but it is stretched thin, and they need additional transport. Every ambulance that can be moved is being requested for immediate service. How's the ammunition situation? Tommy asks, because in Italy the supply lines are somewhat more stable, but ammunition is still a resource that requires accounting. We're managing, the MO replies. The bigger problem right now is maintaining security. The roads around Cassino are still active battleground. We've got Italian military who don't want the facility moved, German prisoners being held at secondary locations, and a general situation where nobody is quite sure who is directing what. Keep your wits about you and your ambulances ready to move if the tactical situation changes. This is the kind of situation that had not existed in Normandy. In Normandy, the front lines were reasonably well defined. You knew roughly where the British positions were and where the German positions were, and the areas between them, while dangerous, had a kind of organized chaos to them. In Italy, the situation is murkier. There are Italian civilians who have lost everything. There are German soldiers, some of them captured, some of them still active in the hills. There are Italian military personnel, some of whom are working with the Allies, and some of whom are ambivalent about the entire situation. And there's the basic reality that the war here is grinding, slow, expensive, and without clear resolution. The subsequent runs take James through terrain that reminds him that he has never actually seen mountains before. The roads in Italy do not simply have craters. They wind through mountains and along cliffs, and the craters, when they exist, have additional significance, because missing a turn means falling not just into a crater, but down a mountainside. The ambulance is not designed for mountain driving. It is designed for roads, for flat terrain, for navigation that does not require constant careful steering to avoid dropping off a cliff face. One particular run, collecting wounded from a position high in the mountains, takes 4 hours. The distance, measured on a map, would be 8 miles. The actual driving is more like 12 miles, because the road winds and switchbacks, and in places consists of little more than a goat path that has been widened slightly to allow vehicles to pass. The wounded, 3 soldiers with various injuries from a German counterattack, are in the back, and the sounds they make as the ambulance navigates the curves and the elevation changes are the sounds of men in pain attempting not to scream, because screaming requires breath and energy they do not have. "How's everyone doing?" Morrison calls from the back, not really expecting answers, but using the sound of his voice to provide some human connection to the injured man. "How far to the hospital?" one of the soldiers asks. His name tag reads Henderson, and he has a shoulder wound that is being managed by the field dressing, but is still bleeding enough that Morrison is checking it at regular intervals. 2 hours if the road stays clear, Morrison replies. "Maybe less if we get lucky." "We haven't had luck in weeks," Henderson says. "I'd settle for not getting attacked between here and there." The conversation dies out, and the ambulance continues its slow, careful navigation down the mountain. The view is spectacular in a way that is completely irrelevant to the people inside the ambulance, who are experiencing the beauty only as obstacles and complications to the fundamental goal of reaching medical care. The winter, as it deepens, brings snow to the mountains around Cassino. The roads become more treacherous. The view becomes simultaneously clearer and more dangerous. You can see farther, but the footing is less certain, and the tactical situation around Cassino becomes worse. The Allies have attempted multiple times to break through the German lines, and each attempt has resulted in casualties that need transport, in wounded that need to be moved down from positions that are increasingly difficult to access. James has been in Italy for 3 months now. The summer seems like it was years ago, though it was only months. Normandy is a memory that feels like something from another lifetime. The constant tension of driving in darkness, of navigating destroyed roads, of making split-second decisions about routing and risk, that has been replaced by the constant tension of mountain driving, of navigating switchbacks and ice, of driving slowly enough to be safe, but fast enough to matter. One night. February in Italy is still night, though the nights are shorter than they were in December. James is instructed to make a run to a position that has been essentially cut off by a German counterattack. The position is being held by a company of Italian infantry, who have called for medical evacuation. There are wounded, apparently, and they are running low on supplies. The ambulance needs to get through to provide both transport and supplies. "You'll go alone," the medical officer explains. "We can't spare 2 ambulances, and we can't spare an escort right now. It's relatively quiet in that sector tonight, but you need to understand the risks. If you encounter German positions, they might shoot at you. The Red Cross provides some protection, but that protection is not absolute." "When has it ever been?" James says. "All right, I'll go alone. Load me up with supplies." Morrison wants to go with him. You'll need someone in the back, he argues. If you pick up wounded, you need someone to attend to them. I'll manage, James says. Or I'll pick someone up at the position if there is someone available. That's not how this works, Morrison argues. We need. Morrison, James interrupts. I'm going. You're too valuable to lose on a route like this on a night like this. There will be runs tomorrow and tomorrow night and the night after that. You need to be functional for those. I can handle this one alone. This is a kind of argument they have had before, and it always ends the same way. James goes and Morrison stays, and the ambulance disappears into the darkness. There is a protocol for this. The ambulance will radio in every 30 minutes. If a radio check is missed, a search will be initiated, though what will be searched and with what resources is never entirely clear. The road up to the position is steep and narrow, and the snow is heavy enough that James is navigating partially by memory and partially by assumption. The headlights, still masked in the way they have been throughout the war, provide minimal illumination. The curves come up suddenly, and for each curve, James makes a calculation about speed and grip and the possibility of sliding off the road and down the mountainside. An hour into the drive, the radio crackles. Hartley, this is base. Confirm position. James keys the microphone. About 2 miles from the forward position, climbing toward the main ridge. Road is heavy with snow. Progress is slow but steady. Understood. Continue and advise when you arrive at the position. The communication is brief and efficient, and it provides James with a moment of connection to something larger than himself before the isolation of the mountain road closes back in. He is alone in the ambulance with supplies, and the understanding that somewhere above him, there are wounded men who are waiting for these supplies and for evacuation if their situation permits. The position, when James finally reaches it, is barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. There are soldiers visible in the darkness, and they move toward the ambulance with a kind of desperate caution that suggests they are still uncertain whether this vehicle represents help or additional threat. The Italian soldiers, though, recognize the Red Cross, and they approach more openly, calling out in Italian that seems to get progressively more complex as James attempts to understand what they are saying. Wounded, he asks, using the Italian word he has learned. Faraday? Yes, Faraday. One of the soldiers confirms. 3 men. One is bad. Very bad. The 3 wounded are brought to the ambulance. One has a leg wound that appears to be infected, the smell of the infection clear even in the cold mountain air. One has a shoulder injury that is being managed with what appears to be personal clothing instead of proper medical dressing. The 3rd man, the very bad one, has an abdominal wound that is oozing through field dressings, and his breathing is labored in a way that suggests significant internal injury. This one needs surgery immediately. The Italian officer, a lieutenant apparently, with the kind of exhaustion that suggests he has been awake for days, tells James. The others can wait if necessary, but this one, you understand? This one will die if he does not get to a hospital immediately. I understand, James confirms. I will take him directly to the hospital. The other 2 can come also, but this one will be the priority for delivery. Loading the 3 men into the ambulance is complicated by the fact that there is no one to assist with the loading. Morrison is not here, and the Italian soldiers, while willing to help, do not understand how to move wounded men without causing additional injury. James ends up doing most of the work himself, positioning stretchers, securing the wounded men, checking that they are as comfortable as circumstances permit. The drive back down the mountain is a nightmare navigation of the most precise kind. The ambulance is now carrying 3 wounded men, which means every movement has consequences. Braking too hard can throw them around in the back. Going too fast around a curve can cause them to slide. The snow, which was heavy going up, is even heavier now. It appears to be actively falling, accumulating on the road at a rate that is beginning to concern James for the fundamental question of whether the vehicle will even be able to maintain traction to get down the mountain. The radio crackles. Hartley, this is base. Status check. You should be starting descent by now. Confirmed. Descent is in progress. Loaded with 3 wounded. Snow is heavy, visibility is low. Making slow progress. Estimate arrival at hospital 0330 hours. Understood. Continue advising every 30 minutes. James focuses on the road. The curves come up out of the darkness, and he navigates them with the kind of precision that comes from absolute necessity and minimal margin for error. The 3 wounded men in the back are quiet now. Shock or pain, or the simple exhaustion of trauma, has rendered them silent. There's nothing but the sound of the engine and the soft hiss of tires and snow and the wind that has kicked up along the mountainside. Halfway down the mountain, the ambulance begins to slip. It is not a dramatic skid, not a sudden loss of control, but rather a gradual feeling of the tires losing grip on the snow-covered road. James eases off the accelerator, attempting to maintain forward momentum while accepting that speed is not currently possible. The ambulance continues its slow descent, and James begins the particular mental calculation of how much time he has before the 3 wounded men in the back begin to deteriorate to the point where a slow journey becomes a fatal journey. The checkpoint appears suddenly in the headlights, or rather, it appears as a figure in the darkness waving a torch. James slows, uncertain whether this is an Italian position, a German position, or something else entirely. In the fog and snow, the distinction becomes theoretical rather than practical. Halt! A voice in Italian, authoritative and clear. Hospital ambulance. Confirmed. James replies in Italian that is technically incorrect, but hopefully understandable. Carrying wounded. Need to pass through quickly. You are coming from forward position? Yes. 3 wounded. 1 critical. A soldier approaches the window of the ambulance, shining a torch into James's face and temporarily blinding him. The soldier is Italian, and he is examining the ambulance with the kind of care that suggests he has orders to inspect every vehicle that passes through the checkpoint. Papers, the soldier demands. James produces his papers, his military identification, the transfer orders for the ambulance, the authorization to transport wounded. The soldier examines them by torchlight, his face creased with the particular concentration of someone who does not get to read often and wants to ensure he is reading accurately. The wounded, these are from a position, the soldier asks. Yes. 1 is critical. He needs to reach the hospital immediately. You have medical personnel with you? No. I am alone. This seems to trouble the soldier. He looks back at the ambulance, as if expecting additional people to somehow materialize out of the darkness. This is irregular, he says. Normally, an ambulance carries medical personnel. Under normal circumstances, yes. James agrees. But we do not have an excess of medical personnel, and the situation required that someone be sent immediately. I am trained for basic care and can maintain the conditions of the wounded until we reach the hospital. The soldier considers this, his face reflecting the kind of logic that suggests he understands the reasoning but is uncomfortable with the deviation from procedure. All right, he finally says. Pass through. But be careful. There have been reports of German movement in this sector. Some of the positions are not secure. Understood. James says. Thank you. The ambulance continues down the mountain. The checkpoint is passed. The descent continues. The snow is not letting up, but the road is beginning to show signs of transitioning from mountain pass to something more navigable. The ambulance begins to move slightly faster as the gradient decreases and the road becomes less treacherous. The hospital, when James finally reaches it, is beginning to stir for the day shift. The night staff is still present, but there is a sense of transition happening. The 3 wounded men are unloaded. The critical abdominal wound case is taken immediately to surgery. The other 2 are triaged and placed in beds for assessment. The Italian soldier with the infected leg wound, it turns out, has septic shock beginning, and the doctors move with urgency to get 4 fluids started and antibiotics administered. James is given tea and told to wait because the ambulance will need to be refueled and checked for mechanical issues, and he will be asked questions about the journey and the condition of the men when he arrived. But before any of that happens, a medical officer approaches him. How long were you driving? The officer asks. 3 hours down, about an hour and a half up. James replies. A bit over 4 hours total. Alone. Alone. With 3 wounded men. One of them in critical condition? Yes, sir. The officer looks at him for a long moment, and James understands that he is being evaluated for something, either for commendation or for being removed from active duty, for exceeding his authority, or for simply being too tired to be trusted with further operations. The officer's expression suggests that the calculation is uncertain. "You did good work," the officer finally says, "but you should not have gone alone. The regulations exist for a reason. If you had crashed, if you had gotten lost, if anything had gone wrong, those men would have been simply lost. No rescue, no recovery, just gone into the Italian mountains." "Yes, sir," James says. "I understand. But you'd do it again if the situation required it," the officer states, and it is not a question. "Yes, sir." The officer nods, acknowledging the particular logic of the situation. "All right, get some rest. We'll have more runs for you soon enough." If you are watching this and are compelled by the stories of the RAMC drivers, the orderlies, the medical personnel who sustained the flow of evacuations across multiple theaters of war, I urge you to subscribe to this channel. We have many more untold stories of the men and women who worked in the medical services during the Second World War. These are stories of quiet courage, of decisions made in darkness and cold, of the systems that kept the human machinery of war functioning even when the machinery itself was pushed beyond its design limits. These are the stories that rarely make it into the official histories, but that changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who otherwise would have died on battlefields or in aid posts or in the back of ambulances driving through the darkness. Subscribe now to join our community of people who believe these stories matter, who believe that the hidden struggles deserve to be remembered and honored.